Hello, everyone. Very good afternoon, evening, and morning to all attending this session on enhancing ASEAN participation in global and regional value chains. My name is Mikic. I'm joining from Waikato University of New Zealand, and I have a pleasant task of moderating this session. We are very excited to have so many participants from across the region and from many corners of the globe. I invite all to participate actively by placing questions in the chat box. More about that shortly. As said, our session is on enhancing ASEAN participation in GVCs and RVCs in global value chains and regional value chains. You will learn lots about acronyms, I think, in this session. And I know that most of you have heard about value chains during the last 2 years of pandemic, more than you ever wanted to know, I guess. But then also you heard about problems and disruptions. And we want to talk about other side of value chains as well. There are very good experiences from the value chains, particularly in Southeast Asia and ASEAN countries, because the value chains have been the conduit of growth, prosperity, and lately supply of essential goods when they were needed, and they helped managing pandemics as well. However, they are also associated with some undesirable consequences. Hopefully, this session will provide information, insights, and perspectives towards answering many questions you and us, included us, have increasingly about the future of GVCs and regional value chains. This session, I have to say, is centered on economic and business perspectives, but we are very well aware that impacts of the past and recent geopolitical factors are also important. So we expect that we will also include them in our discussion in this session. With this, let us now turn to our keynote speaker, Dr. Caroline Freund. She is the Dean of School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. And she is joining us with a recorded message.
Thanks to the Southeast Asia Development Symposium for inviting me. I wish I could be there in person, but the time difference makes it difficult. I want to focus on 3 points about global value chains. First, I want to talk a bit about the pre-shock era, what stimulated their growth in the 1990s and early 2000s, and why they slowed, the supply chain disruption during the current shock, and then finally, I want to close with the outlook and with the outlook for global value chains and some policy recommendations. So let me start with a definition. What do we mean when we talk about global value chains? Trade that crosses more than one border. So for an example, think about imported cloth to make a shirt, and then a company exports the shirt. The cloth crosses 2 borders, once when it comes in, and then again when it leaves the country. So that's what a global value chain is. Why does it matter? It matters because it's a kind of hyperactive trade. Companies can not only take advantage of their comparative advantage in producing a good, but in producing a very specific stage of production. They can also take advantage of returns to scale. For example, 80% of the buttons in the world are produced in one town in China. But dependencies are created. Global supply chains often involve customization or safety certificates. That means that companies are connected in a very specific way and relationships are formed. But because borders are crossed multiple times, trade costs matter far more for global value chains than they do for standard trade. Technological advances such as the internet and the ease of coordination, as well as e-marketplaces, made it easier for firms to trade with one another and to manage complex production across factories in different countries. But liberalization, trade liberalization, the reduction of tariffs in developing countries, as well as many big events made GVCs possible. The WTO was formed. The EU made a single market. Eastern European countries acceded to the EU. NAFTA was formed in this period. China opened up to the world and joined the WTO. As a result of all this activity, the global value chain share of trade, the share of trade that's crossing more than one border, grew from 40% in 1990 to over 50% before the global financial crisis. Then, after the global financial crisis, trade stagnated, growth stagnated, and the formation of GVCs slowed substantially. So countries were still intertwined. Intermediate inputs still made up a big share of trade, but there wasn't this kind of growth that there had been in the earlier period. Then shift ahead, and two additional shocks happened. First, the trade conflict between the US and China, which disrupted trade among two of the largest trade partners in the world. And then the COVID shock. And we think of it as a supply chain disruption, but really it was much more of a demand shock. So initially, there was a huge decline in demand as everyone stayed home. And there was a supply shock because companies slowed production. But then as workers stayed home and weren't spending money on services, they shifted to goods. And in 2021, US GDP growth was actually 5.7%, the best showing since 1984, over 1 percentage point higher than even the most optimistic forecasters at the beginning of the year. There was this tremendous shift to the purchase of goods. Because people weren't going to the gym, they wanted to buy Pelotons. Because they weren't spending on travel, they wanted bigger or remodeled houses. Despite all the stories of ships sitting in LA and Long Beach ports, container traffic was actually up 16% over the previous high in 2018. Imports and consumption were up 25%. I looked in detail at the goods where both price and quantity increased in 2021. So goods where demand was the shock, the quantity increased and so did the price, and 40% of imports saw both rising in 2021 strongly. In contrast, the share of goods where prices were rising and quantities were falling or stagnant, so the share of goods where it was really about supply, prices were going up, but quantities weren't keeping up, was fairly flat over the whole period of COVID at about 20%. So really, in this last year, we've just seen this tremendous demand shock, and not surprisingly, there are capacity constraints and supply can't keep up. So the big question now is, when will things settle down? So if you talk to people in the industry, you get lots of different answers, from 6 months to 18 months. And more recently, the Ukraine-Russia conflict has added increased uncertainty as prices of commodities are rising and stressing markets even more. And with COVID spreading in China, more closures may disrupt supply chains going forward. So what are companies doing in this period of shocks to demand and shocks to supply and so much uncertainty? Well, economic theory has a simple answer. It's optimal to wait when there's uncertainty. And that's exactly what we see. We see companies not sure if they're going to invest more. They don't know if this demand is going to remain high, or if when COVID is finally eradicated, we'll see more standard demand and a shift back to services. And it's really different if you look across time. At the beginning of the crisis in 2020, a lot of firms being surveyed were saying, we're going to reduce investment, or that's what we think will happen. But by the end of 2020 and throughout 2021, the response has been much more about no change expected, and finally a little bit more plans to invest more. So we've really seen this shift in investment plans, but most firms are still sitting on their hands. So policy uncertainty was the big issue before COVID, but in some ways it helped companies to prepare. They were already thinking a bit about their supply chains. Now, policy is coming back into play. Countries are talking about subsidies, buying local, industrial policy. And this is going to create new issues. There's also the carbon border adjustment that's being considered, especially in Europe, that will also lead to readjustment if implemented, as it will discriminate against more carbon intensively produced goods. So there's still a lot of uncertainty around policy looking forward. In terms of technologies, there are some technologies that are very likely to boost trade, especially in services. We're already seeing so much more data crossing borders as we've shifted to remote work and realize that many things can be done remotely. Just as containerization reduced trade costs enormously, and the decline in air travel costs, which led to high value goods traveling in the bellies of planes, we can see new revolutions potentially for services trade from increased use of digital communications. There's also this kind of digital mapping of supply chains that will allow companies to find efficiencies without a reliability trade-off. So that will help to improve trade going forward. And artificial intelligence can even be applied to things like packing shipping containers and picking shipping routes for greater efficiencies. So they're competing forces, but right now, one thing stymieing investment and trade growth is really this uncertainty. To try and understand how firms think in the context of uncertainty, with some colleagues at the World Bank, we looked at what happened to trade in the medium to long run following the tsunami in Japan in 2011, which disrupted supply chains, especially in autos and electronics. And while there was talk then of reshoring and nearshoring, what really happened, and diversification, was a shift away from Japan to other low-cost, large suppliers. There was no reshoring or nearshoring, and importers didn't look for more diversified supply. They simply shifted away from Japan, which was thought of as a less reliable trade partner. But it's unlikely to be as rapid in the current environment because capital was not destroyed. In the case of Japan, some capital was destroyed, so it could either be rebuilt in Japan or elsewhere. So once you're already spending the money to rebuild, you'll look for the lower cost location. That's not the case now, so that will slow down any type of readjustment. So when we think about policies going forward, especially for the ASEAN countries, they already are fairly competitive in terms of productivity and logistics. Many of them are big players in global value chains and increasingly attracting investment in trade. But what they need to do now, the most important thing, is predictability. Predictable trade policies, predictable macro policies, and a predictable investment climate. Because there's so much uncertainty in the world, what companies are thinking about when they invest is finding a place that can produce efficiently, but also one that is predictable. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
I was just going to say thank you so much, Caroline. We wish you were here in person, on the screen at least, and in real time. Caroline's message included a nice mix of the views about past, present, and future of global value chains. And so it's really nicely set the stage for our discussion on global value chains in and for ASEAN economies. And we have a stellar group of panelists who will help us understand some challenging issues in this subject area. But before I introduce the panelists, let me just remind once again the participants to use the chat box to post their questions or comments as they may be, and they can do it all throughout the session, but we will look at those after we go through a couple of rounds of questions, I hope, if we manage in the time that we have in front of us. So just kindly affix your name and institutions or designation and whom you are addressing the question, if you have person in mind. And then we are looking forward to use those probing and interesting questions in the last part of this session. So I will introduce the panelists in alphabetical order. I will also remind everyone that fuller information about all speakers is available on the SEADS platform. So please look it up, because I'm not going to read all these beautiful bios here. That will take the whole time of the whole session. And I, of course, ask for the forgiveness for not doing so. So whom do we have with us in this session? It's Deborah Elms, founder and director, Asian Trade Center. Badri Narayanan Gopalakrishnan, lead advisor, NITI Aayog, India. Cyn-Young Director, Regional Cooperation and Integration Division, Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department of the Asian Development Bank. Kelvin Pereira, Operating Managing Director, Vickers Venture Partners. Michael Plummer, Annie Professor of International Economics and Director of School of Advanced International Studies, Europe, Johns Hopkins University. And last but not the least, Christian Figelan, Senior Economist, Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific of International Labor Organization. So, my dear panelists, welcome to this session. And let us start with the discussion or conversation as we planned. I will first go through one round of questions and then hopefully through the second one before we open for the floor discussion from the participants. And I'm going to change things a little bit. I will start from the small to the big, from the small actors in international economy to the big picture. So my first question will go to Deborah Elms. And Deborah, you have been working through your Asian Trade Center with SMEs of ASEAN and also in other parts of Asia, but dominantly ASEAN, in providing them huge support in their dealings with complexities of value chains, regional trade agreements, digitalization, and you name it, lots of things. Even before the pandemics, there were calls for relooking of the value chains, and the pandemics then really upped the game and started talking about more serious changes in the business models, from just in a time to just in case, and serious de-risking in the management of value chains. So we have gone through 2 years of this efforts to increase the resilience, and I would want to ask you or find from you, what is the situation on the ground with SMEs? Have what's happening in terms of their resilience and how they look at future chances of staying in value chains with this increased, as we heard from the keynote speaker, increased unpredictability, volatility, and uncertainty in business and economic environment. Deb, mic is yours.
Thank you very much. So I think any small business that has survived the last 2 years in Asia under COVID restrictions is resilient, because you didn't make it this far if your business wasn't able to pivot, if you weren't able to draw on resources both within yourself, within your staff, and within your community to sustain your business. And we've seen a lot of small businesses across this region that have not made it, that they may have been very resilient, but they may have also been unlucky, because if you're in certain sectors, if you're in the tourism sector in Asia, you are really, and a small business, forget it. I mean, it's been so difficult for you to be able to survive the last 2 years. So that's not because you weren't resilient, but just because you were unlucky. If you were in other sectors, maybe you were able to pivot your business, or maybe you got really lucky and you happen to be in a sector like educational services in the digital space, and you've gone through the roof with demand because you've been able to deliver. So I think there's a variation across small businesses in their ability to navigate COVID and all of the restrictions around COVID. But it has also highlighted, I would say, many of the challenges that we already knew were there for small businesses around the capacity that a small business has to respond to any kind of shock. And the difficulty that our small businesses have had in the last 2 years is trying to adjust to a rapidly changing environment, both domestically, and then if they have overseas customers, or if they had intended to be overseas, if they're working with other players, larger or smaller, in terms of buying things from them or selling back into them. That has been a real challenge for small businesses. And so how they navigate that has highlighted, I would say, the importance of consistency as much as possible, because small businesses can deal with a lot of things, but when we have inconsistency, and especially inconsistent policies, it's very hard for small businesses to navigate. So even things like, inconsistent travel rules, inconsistent rules, and now it's going to get worse with, frankly, with Ukraine and sanctions and so forth, inconsistencies around the application of policies that are changing very quickly. Even businesses that would say, I'm not in a supply chain. My firm is too small. I'm not in a supply chain. If you think about it creatively, that even small firms can be considered part of a supply chain, because they're buying raw materials, parts, components, whatever, for something, and they're making something and selling it, or they're in the services sector, which can also be part of a supply chain. And so, they have been badly disrupted. And I would say, again, the key lesson for me last 2 years, and we knew it anyways, but really the last 2 years on steroids, disruption and non-aligned policies in different settings are just a real problem for small businesses. So I think that's, for me, key lesson. If you've made it, you're resilient, but that doesn't mean it's easy for you. So whatever we could do to make life easier for our smaller businesses who employ most workers across Asia and generate the most jobs and are the largest share of businesses is critically important. I think we should put SMEs first rather than always putting SMEs last. Let me stop there and let the rest of my panel come in on something.
Thank you, Deb. And I try to do just that. I've put the SMEs front and center in our discussion. But there are other actors. So let me turn to Kevin, because I want to ask him about one other big actor in important for value chains. And Kevin, we always look at trade and investment as two sides of one trade coin or GVC coin. And I want to ask you about the role of lead multinational corporations and their long-term investments in providing resilience in value chains. And in particular, from the ASEAN perspective, is that being changing through this course for shifting relocation or moving, and what's your perspective on that?
Hi, Mia. Thank you. That's a great question. And I think it ties in a lot with what Deborah said, in terms of commerce and investment. There have been, two sides of the same coin. And increasingly, that line is actually blurring. So it's almost becoming the same coin, right? And I say this because, you've seen, pre-COVID, where there was an increasing feel that people were actually starting to become a little bit more nationalistic. Things were starting to get to that smaller, think about me, my region, my trade block only. And what COVID has done is actually maybe change that a little bit. And that could be for the better. I know everyone's talking about COVID, and I'm actually being very purposeful in trying to focus on the opportunities versus the obstacles, right? And as much as everyone talks about the global supply chain and the value chain and the creation, from my point of view, from the investment side, it has always been the multinationals through their CVC arms, or the venture capital arms, that were trying to spur investment and innovation. And right now, given the amount of attention you have, that's actually moving at a faster pace. Deborah mentioned things about education and adjusting to supply chain disruptions through technology, and innovation. We're trying to adjust. And that's kind of changing, the whole template of how you look at it. With regard to ASEAN in total, what we do as an investment firm is we've looked out to 2040. And by then, we've got a lot of notable economists on the panel, so I won't dwell too much, but, conceivably, 3 out of the largest blocks of GDP are going to be Asian, right? You're going to start to see this rise of the Asian consumer. And ASEAN as a bloc is the 5th largest GDP contributor to that. And with that, you take another page out of history, you've always seen outsourcing. COVID could be the key element where you're starting to see outsourcing out of China into the Southeast Asian markets, a reemergence of the Asian tigers, a focus on things like food tech, clean tech, health tech. As this Asian consumer emerges, these are the things they're going to be consuming. I think ASEAN is actually poised to not only be the hotbed for those technologies, for those services, but also one of the key consumers for that. So I'm not sure if I'm, if I brought a lot of that, but, and I think in what Deborah said, I think that's going to be one of the key things. SMEs are going to stand front and foremost in leading the change, moving away from very big, bulky government organizations to be a little bit more agile.
Thank you, Kevin. For that, you actually sort of front-loaded also the issues of technology innovation. We'll come back to that later on, I promise, because we know that this is something that really is seen as the biggest driver of positive changes and responding to the challenges. But challenges that also this SEADS 2022 is addressing around sustainability and inclusivity. So let me go a little bit into those topics, and let me call upon you, Badri, because you have investigated the links between climate change, mitigation, and trade very deeply. And of course, you have taken a look at the trade that is based on GVCs, but also conventional trade. So I think the very or the current research that is being in the pipeline is about looking at ASEAN Paris Agreement commitments in terms of the reduction of emissions and how the fulfillment of those commitments would affect ASEAN's competitiveness and ability to stay engaged in global value chains. Very briefly and without technicalities, if you can bring us to speed on what is the expectation.
Thank you so much, Mia, for the question, and glad to be here. And on this point, we looked at two aspects. One is to do a kind of an ex post assessment as to what happened in the past from 2010 to 2020 in terms of emissions. When we look at the ASEAN regions, the only country which has actually reduced emissions between these 2 years, 2010 to 2020, was Singapore, which has reduced around 20% emissions. All the other countries have increased emissions by quite a lot. Some countries have increased it twice, and some countries over 10 times. So it's quite kind of surprising to see the increase in emissions. So what we actually did was, instead of thinking of the really ambitious Paris Accord commitments, particularly for the ASEAN countries, which are all developing countries, we thought that why don't we just say that they stay constant from now, so there's no further increase in emissions. Instead of saying that the emissions will be reduced by a lot, we thought a more realistic way to do would be to keep it at the same level as today, except for Singapore, which has already reduced its emissions and it's on track as per the commitments. And for Singapore, we can assume that it reaches the 2030 targets. So when we do that kind of an analysis, we particularly note that electricity is an important sector, which accounts for 40% of total energy consumed and 30% of the emissions. So we wanted to break that down into multiple renewables, looking at the renewables and non-renewables. And that is the channel in which you can reduce emissions. The way to reduce emissions is to move away from non-renewables, fossil fuels, and into the renewables. So when we actually try to do that exercise to see that the emissions would either decline in the case of Singapore, or stay the same for the other countries from between these 2 years, 2020 and 30, we actually saw that it can lead to some significant disruptions, starting from the macroeconomic level, where several countries may lose a little bit, ranging from 0.2 to 2% of GDP. But yeah, this is over a period of 10 years, so it's not like annual. But still it is significant, particularly for these developing countries. But of course, there is a possibility for some boost in the renewable resources. And then if we look at the trade and global value chains, since these countries, ASEAN countries, are intricately entangled with several countries in the world, this can also have some ripple effects. So there can be effects that are visible across the world. So I'm not getting into a lot of numbers here because of course we are talking at a very high level, but conceptually what we kind of find is that there can be some economic implications, both in terms of macroeconomic level, in terms of GDP, employment, and so on, and also at a trade, global value chain level, in terms of new opportunities for the upstream and downstream industries that are related to renewables, and lost opportunities for the fossil fuel sectors. And both these set of sectors, they have a lot of interrelationships across the global value chain. So there can be significant effects. But now on the positive side, we can also infer from our analysis that the more open the global value chains are, the easier is it for emissions reduction as well, because the ASEAN countries need a lot of equipment, a lot of technologies to move towards renewables away from non-renewables. So that is a very positive role the global value chains can play in order to help the emissions reduction. So I think I will take a pause here. These are the broad kind of findings that I wanted to mention, and I can come back later for further questions.
Thank you, Badri. So basically, what you're saying that among those, effects that we normally take into account between trade and environment, the technique effect, we're expecting it to really run up the positive opportunities, and the others will be then sort of neutralized, if I may say so. Just a little jab, Badri, if I can come back to you on this. Trade economists are always annoyed when we calculate sort of gains from liberalization of trade, and we get sort of results in terms of 0.2, 0.3% increase in GDP that is always deemed to be not significant, irrelevant. And now when we get a negative effect of 0.2%, that seems to be significant. Why is that so?
Sure, Mia. I think, we as trade economists, even when we get to 0.2% kind of results, we say that they are significant. Because they are actually, if you look at the absolute changes in millions of dollars, billions of dollars, they are huge. But I also want to mention something that I did not emphasize enough in my previous discussion, which is that all these findings we got from this model, these are more looking at purely economic impacts, not the really long-term implications of the emissions. So we're not even getting into the climate science part of it, like if these emissions stay, what kind of damage they can result in, and so on. So I think if you take that into account, these negative effects that I mentioned, which can be thought of as significant or insignificant depending on how we interpret it, they may actually be rendered even more insignificant, if not when they can be totally outweighed by the potential positive effects of the emissions reduction. So if the emissions were not reduced, what would be the negative economic effect? If you take that into account, these are insignificant, is what I would like to emphasize in that sense.
Thank you so much, Badri. I'm sorry if I have put you on the spot, but I just thought we owe audience the answer on these things. But you did mention that apart from economic, we have other problems, and very often the issues of employment are deemed in our theories as non-economic. But that's again to be discussed. But I'm turning now to Christian, because he, of course, being in International Labour Organization, is studying this trade jobs and trade employment nexus day in and day out. And so he has done marvelous work on impact of GVCs on employment and labor markets in ASEAN and in other countries, particularly through the manufacturing sector. So what can you tell us, Christian, about the patterns of the relationship between trade or GVC-based trade and jobs or labor markets in ASEAN? And can we somehow turn the negative effects, because I presume there were some, into positives?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mia, for making this link to jobs and employment, because when we talk about enhancement of or enhancing the participation of ASEAN in global value chains, and of course we also need to bear in mind what the ultimate objective is, and one central objective is, I think, the creation of jobs as well as incomes. So before I move to the role of trade, let me perhaps start with bringing again in front of us what is actually the current situation on the labor market in Southeast Asia, and what has been the situation over the past 2 years or so. So what we have seen is clearly, I mean, an unprecedented impact. I mean, not only in this region, but globally. But for this region, actually for 2020, we estimate that actual hours worked in the economies of Southeast Asia went down by 7.9% compared to before the crisis. And just, like to perhaps generate a number that is a little bit more, like crispy, that one can grasp in an easier way. This 7.9%, so this corresponds to the working time of 22 million full-time workers. If we assume a 48-hour work, and this is just a very, very huge number. Even in 2021, we still estimate working hour losses compared to before the pandemic of 7.3%. And also for the current year, we project still working hour losses of 3.3%. So this is actually the highest working hour losses among all sub-regions in Asia. And we have seen job losses, and we also have seen that labor incomes suffered quite substantially, leading as well to an unprecedented increase in working poverty. So that's the people that do have a job, but nevertheless remain below the international poverty line. And even now, jobs in numerous sectors and countries of the region still continue to feel the impact. So this is like the overall picture. So now what has been the role of trade exactly, and also global value chains? Well, a large number of jobs in this region is actually related, obviously, to trade and GVCs. And they have suffered negative impacts, I think, through two main channels. So I think the first channel was really this drop in global consumer demand for some particular products. So for example, especially in the course of 2020, we have seen consumer demand for garments plummeting. And a lot of economies in this region are obviously, and a lot of jobs in this region are dependent on this global garment consumption. And so this has been clearly one main channel of impact, like this lower consumer demand. And another obvious example for this is the tourism sector. So here we are talking about services exports. So consumer demand in some countries, at least for some months, has been really close to zero in the tourism sector. And for example, we have recently published a brief where we looked at 5 countries in the region. And we did see actually that job losses in the tourism sector in those countries were about four times greater than in non-tourism sectors. So this is really a major channel of impact. But then on the other hand, the second main channel of impact that is, I think, still relevant now is the channel of imported inputs. Because production in some other countries at a certain point in time, has stood still. So factories were closed, so the inputs were not really provided, and inputs also that are being used in this region, and jobs depend on these inputs as well. Jobs in this region, and just yesterday, I think maybe some of you might have followed the news that some provinces in China are currently again under lockdown, with the factories being closed. And of course, this is kind of relevant for Southeast Asia, who is quite a lot dependent on inputs coming from China. So this is basically what has happened in the trade context. So now, what are the longer term changes of the relationship between trade and jobs, and also in the context of distribution of gains from trade? Here, before I conclude with this first statement, I just would like to make 2 points. So one thing I think to consider is, I mentioned these tremendous labor market impacts, but it's really, it is fact that not everyone in this region, not every worker has been, and not every enterprise has been affected equally. So for example, what we have seen is that younger workers have been more affected than adult workers, older workers. Women have been more affected than men. Workers in smaller companies have been more affected than workers in larger companies. And also workers in lower medium skilled jobs or in jobs that tend to be low wage jobs suffered more than workers in higher skilled jobs or in jobs that pay better. And of course, all this does raise some concerns about inequality. And the question is, will some of these impacts remain even, after at a certain point we will have left this pandemic behind us? So are any of these jobs going to come back? These jobs for young workers, for women, and also, yeah, these jobs for, let's say, low or medium skill type of occupations. You know, perhaps it's a little bit early to say, but I do think that policies as well do have a role to make sure that these jobs come back. Thinking about, for example, gender policies or policies specifically targeting youth, and also actually value chains do have a role actually of creating these jobs. And Deborah in the beginning was focusing on the SMEs, and SMEs obviously do also have a very, very critical role in this job creation. And the second point that I just wanted to make, you know, like also looking forward is, I think, you know, like there's a lot of talking and also action by companies about increasing resilience. So companies don't want to be anymore only dependent, you know, like on one big consumer market or one big source from which they source their inputs. So diversification is clearly needed. But then, like in the context of jobs, I think it's also relevant to consider that, I mean, this diversification has probably also some costs. So companies are now pricing in some risks that they probably have not priced fully in before the pandemic. And, you know, this does affect the gains from trade, and then also potentially the jobs created from trade. But undoubtedly, I mean, I think many of these decisions, I mean, they need to be taken to make economies more resilient, to make companies more resilient, make supply chains more resilient, and there are clear benefits. And I do also think that there is a huge potential actually to boost especially regional value chains and create jobs in this region. Because yeah, I do think that when reconfiguring value chains, I think very often there's some consideration to let's say to bring the value chains into one region, or to create value chains that are regional. And I do think that there's actually an immense potential there to also create a lot of jobs. With this, yeah, I go back to you, Mia, and looking forward to the other speakers.
Thank you, Kevin. You have triggered so many questions that I have now to you, but I will wait for the next round. But just to let you know where I'm thinking what I'm thinking about is, you know, do we actually protect jobs or people? And, you know, when we talk about return of jobs, are we actually are we future-proofing these economies with the old jobs rather than opening the new ones? And, you know, and I'm going to ask you about automation, future of work, and robotics, but I'm just parking it there because I cannot resist mentioning these. So Michael, let me go to you now, and so your research with another famous professor, you are a tandem in this area with Peter Petri. And thank you both for providing always timely and thorough, comprehensive research on these topics. But in number of the studies that you have done, you have sort of argued that countries may increase their, let me use the term resilience, if they are successful in expanding regional cooperation, and in particular through, you know, being attached or being party to some of the agreements, like comprehensive, progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or regional economic RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Sorry, I said I'm gonna trip on the acronyms here. And I think in one of these you showed that that gains from full implementation of these deals may even compensate for the losses globally that we globally suffered from the trade war. So can you explain to us how this works, and in particular how for ASEAN economies that are party to both of these big mega blocks will work or may work as a shield from from external shocks, man-made or otherwise?
Okay, thanks, Mia. And let me say it's wonderful to be part of this panel, tackling an important topic. And I'd like to thank the ADB and the organizers for the invitation, even at 6:30 this morning, Bologna time. I guess on your last point, Mia, I wouldn't really use the word shield, but rather protection from external shocks that regional cooperation can provide. As everyone knows, ASEAN is tightly integrated into the global marketplace, with trade to GDP being about 100%, and it's the most integrated of any other major region. And this is really key to ASEAN's and frankly the entire region's success story. But when barriers are erected against global independence, for example, due to the U.S.-China trade war, rise in protectionism and inward-looking industrial policy, or major national shocks to cross-border interaction, such as the case of the pandemic, when these things occur, potential benefits obviously fall, and adverse external shocks always leave open region exposed. But deeper integration across ASEAN countries and together with Asia-Pacific partners will make it more resilient. At least this is what our research would show. And depending on the shock, it could even make the region stronger. James in his work finds that regional value chains are taking over the work of global value chains already. And our simulations, as you hint, Mia, would suggest that there's a lot more to come. If various exogenous shocks negatively affect complex global chains, and these can be replaced with shorter, sophisticated regional value chains connected with East Asian economies, that's going to help with the ASEAN recovery. Regional economic cooperation can play an important role in this process, bringing down barriers to regional trade and integration and investment, enhances the competitiveness of the region, and ultimately raises welfare and employment. In addition, I'd argue that regional cooperation in Asia-Pacific holds important lessons for multilateral cooperation, but I think that's a theme for a different topic, theme for a different conference. Our empirical simulations, which are designed to capture these economic implications via 3 policy shocks, one, the negative one, the China-US trade war, and 2 positive ones, the CPTPP. Mia, I get tripped up on those acronyms as well, but the more you say it, the easier it comes, and RCEP. And I think that these 3 policy shocks sort of bear out this fact. Cyn-Young Park, who's with us, Peter and I use the CG model to show that the US-China trade conflict underscores the costs of turning back the clock on integration by disrupting value chains and increasing costs to investors and consumers alike. We estimate that the trade war reduces global incomes by 514 billion annually in the long run. Okay, through beginning into 2030, with China bearing the brunt of the welfare effect, but also the United States loses. World exports fall by a whopping $1 trillion, reflecting a large degree the effects on global and regional value chains. The effects on ASEAN countries are mixed. They benefit by replacing some Chinese trade in the US market, but are negatively affected by the shock to China, which is, of course, a key market for ASEAN economies. US and Chinese trade both contract by about the same amount, about $500 billion each. RCEP and the CPTPP, on the other hand, do exactly the opposite. Both of them end up having, we'd argue, important economic effects, with the CPTPP RCEP increasing incomes by almost $300 billion, and the CPTPP by 188 billion on a permanent basis. And if I could go back to that questions you mentioned earlier you posed to Badri, I think that these numbers are actually quite big because it is on a permanent basis and it reflects a change in efficiency. For example, to get the $284 billion in welfare increases through RCEP that we estimate per year, that would be the equivalent of a 4% return on $7 trillion in additional investment. In other words, the payout from, if an annual payout on a $7 trillion capital stock, back of the envelope would be about that value. So it really is significant. And the effects on regional trade are actually double those figures, which reflects the importance of value chains behind these welfare estimates. Moreover, the effects will actually increase as, for example, the coverage of these regional regional cooperation agreements expand. RCEP, for example, has built into it a lot of room for enhancement, and this is typical of ASEAN-centric agreements and ASEAN agreements, that they start out relatively conservatively and then deepen over time, as well as membership. And as you know, for the CPTPP is already considering new members. The UK is first up front as a application that's being considered by the group, and China, Chinese Taipei, and Korea have either applied or will be applying soon. And some ASEAN countries are considering applying as well: Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines, for example. And the CPTPP has a much deeper framework than RCEP, so you could potentially see some very major effects there. So these gains obviously flow from reducing barriers to integration. And in our study, we find that this is particularly due to reduction in non-tariff barriers to goods and services, which together account for about 2/3 of the economic benefits. Accumulation of rules of origin also plays an important role in stimulating trade. And they obviously boost not only regional value chains, but also global value chains, arguably. So in short, while regional cooperation can't create the total shield, as you'd say, Mia, against exogenous shocks from like pandemic or inward-looking external trends, it can certainly help develop greater resiliency and support ASEAN economies going forward and as they recover from the pandemic.
Thank you, Michael. And I think you actually created the perfect segue into my question to Cyn-Young. Thank you for doing that as well. So Cyn-Young, you are actually the ADB face for regional integration and cooperation, because whenever it's mentioned in the context of the ADB work, we expect to see you presenting on that. So I cannot but ask you your comments on where the region will be going now with emerging from pandemic. Let's hope that we are at the tail end of it in terms of regional integration, and how will these regional value chains that Michael mentioned feature in that emergence. And if you can mention, because I do want to make a link to the use of technology and innovation, if you can mention the role of boosting technology and innovation in that context, I would appreciate. So floor is yours.
Thanks, Mia. Well, I think everybody kind of noted that the Asia's resilience in economic and trade performance during the pandemic. Asia's merchandise trade grew very strongly in 2021. Regional trade, in fact, dipped less and recovered faster compared to global trade in 2020 and 2021. Trade growth in the region accelerated even at double-digit rates, reaching 19% by June 2021, before settling down to about over 12% in August 2021. However, high-frequency indicators suggest that the logistics bottlenecks and rising shipping costs continue to pose risks. Tracking the technologies such as the automatic identification system and digitized trade and transport facilitation can be used to improve visibility of the supply chain resilience, and then also help the global maritime network. This can provide an opportunity to optimize the the inventory, and then also the sourcing of input materials, encouraging competition and making the system-wide investment in the entire logistics chain will be very important to reduce the transport costs, at the same time bolster the trade recovery. Geographic concentration of the production has revealed some vulnerability of global supply chain during the pandemic. For example, semiconductor chip production has a very high complex value chain, with each stage require the specialization that currently only a certain number of economies can offer. Currently, 75% of the global installed capacity is concentrated in East Asia. Therefore, single points of failure, especially in East Asian economies, can cause a large-scale supply interruptions globally. Policymakers need to step up efforts to stimulate the R&D and also design the policies that can encourage more the electrical and then mechanical engineering investors to be able to broaden this supply chain network in these high complex industries. Well, overall, the region's intra-regional trade has shown strong resilience, and then that really provided a key driver for trade and economic resilience in Asia. The value chain participation within Asia became quite strong. The overall regional value chain participation in the region increased even during the pandemic. Deepening the regional value chain is also driven by complex value chain linkages in high and medium tech sectors. The region's intra-regional trade share is currently reaching the 60% of the region's total trade. And this has been really largely characterized by the rising participation in complex value chains, which involves intermediate goods crossing border twice or more before the manufactured final goods. And the highest RVC expansion relative to global linkage is happening in the high medium technology sectors, especially in the business services sectors in recent years. As previously mentioned, RCEP entered into the force on as of January 1st, and then this has a very strong potential to deepen regional supply and value chain linkages further. The progressive elimination of customs duties among 15 member economies, together with the common rules of origin, will foster the regional value chain further. We have also witnessed the strong FDI within the region. The investment in Asia Pacific was quite resilient despite relatively sharp fall in the global FDI. Especially East Asia and Southeast Asia were the main destinations in the region, attracting 80% of Asia's inward FDI. The global FDI slipped by over 1/3 in 2020 to less than $1 trillion at the height of pandemic. This level is nearly 20% lower than the 2009 after the GFC. The developed economies felt the most of this effect with the nearly 60% contraction, but Asia's intra-regional investment has been an important factor to show the FDI resilience in the region. The investment is again expected to pick up in this year, continuation of recovery in 2021. Interestingly, the strong FDI in the region was also driven by digital services sector. Digitalization is now transforming how firms operate and then invest overseas. And Asia stands out as an investment hub for digital services in sectors such as telecommunications, computer information services, and then other business services. FDI can further support Asia's digital services exports. Investment has increased in sectors such as data processing, data hosting, and cloud computing, which will all in turn support digital services exports. In order to promote FDI further, especially in the services sector, FDI restrictions in Asia's digital services, such as media, legal, and professional services, need to be addressed and then gradually also removed. International cooperation, especially across the regional economies, can provide a strategic pathways for Asia to capitalize from increased foreign direct investment in digital services. They can also help inform the national reforms of investment incentives, and by having the more investor protection and the strengthening the rule of law. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Cyn-Young. You have actually opened so many other areas that I am bound to go back to the rest of the panel and ask if anyone would want to comment on anything that was mentioned so far, including I know, Deborah, I was going to ask you something next. But since you have been the face of RCEP in the global area of discussions on that, maybe you want to add something with respect to the significance of RCEP and formation or strengthening of value chains for SMEs participating in those. I'm not putting you on the spot, but I'm sure that you have something to add there.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about RCEP. I mean, I think this is any time that you have a regional agreement, or even bigger, better, is global. Global agreements are much easier for small firms to use because it means that the rules apply consistently across a bigger setting. That's always better for small firms. So anytime that you can have regional integration with a consistent rule book and a bunch of provisions and schedules, commitments for governments that are aligned, that's better for small businesses. So I think RCEP is very useful because, of course, it brings together, we're currently active, we're 12 members, with Malaysia joining tomorrow, 18th, Friday, sorry, with Malaysia coming in on Friday. So we're down to just 3 missing members, which I think is great. Remember that RCEP then is active just between the members. So you cannot at the moment use RCEP to trade with Indonesia, Philippines, and Myanmar because they haven't yet approved. And you have to wait till Friday for Malaysia, but the rest of us are all in. So the rest of ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand are part of RCEP. For small businesses who are in Asia in particular, that is their footprint, that is their backyard. And so for them to be able to use this agreement to trade in the region is very helpful. But the challenging part, as with all free trade agreements for small businesses, is that you don't automatically get the benefits of RCEP just because you happen to be in an RCEP country exporting goods or services or investing in another RCEP country. You have to do something that meets the rules in order to have those benefits. And that can be very hard for small businesses to understand because they don't, first of all, they don't even know that they're part of a larger grouping necessarily or what the rules might be. And so they're unable often, they're either unable or frankly, they don't know what the rules are and then how they can take advantage of those. It's very challenging to explain RCEP in a way that makes sense to large businesses, and it's even harder to explain it in ways to make sense to small businesses. But I will mention just briefly, one of the biggest benefits of RCEP on trade and goods is one rule of origin. And so sort of why does that matter? Well, it matters because if you want to make something like, let's see what's on my desk at the moment, a hair tie or something more sophisticated like whatever this USB charger thing is, those products now can be manufactured to RCEP rules. So they can now be created using RCEP provisions. And let me just talk about the hair tie for a second. I'm assuming, now that I look at this, I'm thinking, oh, is this an apparel object? I assume that it is. Okay, so let's assume it's an apparel product. In RCEP, if you use fabric or elastic or something else from any of the members, then and you make it in an RCEP country, you can sell it to an RCEP country and get benefits. And given the tariffs that are often in place on apparel products, shirts and swimsuits and hair ties, that can be a huge savings for small firms. But you can also, and I think this is very helpful for small businesses in this region, you can potentially source fabric, especially, or elastic or buttons from outside of the region, and it will still qualify, because the key for RCEP rules is, was it fabric and now it's a final finished product that's different. And for small businesses, that is amazing, because now they have the access to creating all kinds of apparel and textile products relatively easily, using materials and parts and components in this case that are appropriate for their product, potentially using suppliers that they're familiar with and comfortable with, without having to switch them out necessarily, and be able to produce products and avoid tariffs that can be high on finished textile goods and apparel goods around the region. And so I think that's the kind of example to me that helps businesses, large and small, but especially for the SMEs, because once they make this hair tie, right, they don't just have to sell it in Singapore, they could potentially sell it in Australia, they can send it to the Koreans without having to swap out which fabric they use and so forth. And so again, the more consistency you have in rules for small businesses, the better. And obviously for big businesses, consistency is great too, because it just generally lowers your compliance costs, which is very important for companies, especially today. And it lowers the risk of doing things and getting caught somehow. So bigger agreements better, they help lower your costs. I think RCEP can provide some very useful benefits for small businesses, but it is very challenging. It is a complicated agreement, and getting it translated into language that makes sense to small businesses is hard. We do a lot of it, and it is very challenging to do, but I think there is some payoff in there. So I would love to see, and I'm always happy when groups like ADB invite people to think about perspectives from small businesses and then try to articulate whatever it is we're talking about in a way that makes sense to a small business. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk about this. And for those firms, especially that are listening, if you're not taking advantage of RCEP and you haven't even looked at this agreement, you are missing an opportunity to potentially save money or get more markets, or potentially both. And I think that would be, something, as we're all looking for economic recovery coming out of COVID, we need those opportunities to be presented and to investigate how we might leverage them. So please look at RCEP and see how it might benefit you for trade in and around Asia. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. I have to say that you are not a official spokesperson for RCEP. I don't think that they even have it. But thank you very much for speaking directly to the businesses, because I think you are very right. These are great, trade creation opportunities that the agreement may hold there. But as in many cases across the globe, businesses fail to utilize these because they don't know enough. And this is not true only in the developing world. This is true in Europe and in other sort of developed countries where information circulates perhaps more transparently or quicker. That's questionable, but let me leave it there. Would anyone from the panel want to say something on the first round of questions that we have discussed? Can you please signal somehow by waving or by putting your, if you are familiar with or on friendly terms with Zoom, you can put up your hand. Mike, your hand is up.
Okay, thanks. I'm really enjoying these presentations. Just two one quick comment and one question. I'm struck by with Deborah's talk about, the challenges and the needs of SMEs, which really reminded me of a recent piece that came out from the OECD last year on trade and gender that Jane Korniak and a colleague put together. And it seems like a lot of the same challenges facing women face small and medium-sized enterprises, right? It could be access to credit. A lot of it is information that you've talked about a lot, and the complexity of these things, or networking, and et cetera. So I think that a focus more on SMEs and their challenges will also have this very positive side effect of helping women who are in firms that are engaging in trade. And secondly, Christian asked the question, which I think was rhetorical, but says, will jobs come back? And I'm an optimist by my very nature, and I think that optimism was instilled upon me when I took my first economics class at the University of Michigan, when my economics professor, who was a Marxist, said, this is like in the late 1970s in Michigan, saying, you guys will never find a job. You'll never find a job because the Industrial Revolution is over, third Industrial Revolution is over, and there's nothing is going to be coming. And yet, most of us ended up finding a job. And I think this sort of testifies to resilience of the market when we try to support it. But on a different note, you mentioned, Christian, that about exports of labor-intensive goods, if you will, like in garments, et cetera, to major markets, and that effect on employment. I think that really is sometimes underappreciated, how important that is, particularly for poverty reduction. And I was sort of surprised looking at some of the data surveys that the ILO puts out, and things that, most of apparel and garment production in ASEAN would be considered semi-skilled production. But for some countries like Lao PDR, it is also unskilled labor intensive. And by the way, most of the laborers in that sector were women. And we know that providing jobs for women in lower income countries is very important for poverty reduction. So just to emphasize that point that you're making, that stimulating those markets are extremely important for a variety of reasons. And of course, the lessons for the OECD countries is that this needs to be a priority to liberalize these markets in order to come up with these exports. And that comes up with a barrage of political objections in those countries domestically, but I think that is a topic that we really need to address, and we really haven't done a great job doing it, in my view.
Thank you, Michael. I'm calling upon Christian now to perhaps respond to this with your views on what Michael was saying.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mia, and thank you, Michael, also for making these points. So yeah, I mean, perhaps it's not really the question whether jobs are going to come back or not, but it's I think we should also look at what kind of jobs are going to come back, and I mean, do we want the jobs that were there before the pandemic? Do we want them one-to-one without any change come back? Because I mean, I do think that some of these jobs they did not necessarily. I mean, they were not what we at the ILO call decent. So I mean, we had some jobs with poor quality of working conditions. So it's really also, I think, a matter it's not just about the number of jobs. We want many jobs to come back, of course. But then it's also about what type of jobs are these going to be? I mean, is this going to be jobs that pay decent incomes or not? Is this jobs that provide safe working conditions or not? And I mean, thinking, for example, still focusing on the garment sector. I mean, I do think that we all, even though it's now many years back, we all still have in mind this disaster at Rana Plaza in Bangladesh. It's outside Southeast Asia, but still, I think it shows that these issues are relevant. So we don't want to kind of like have just any type of job come back, but we really want to have good quality jobs come back. And I mean, you also emphasized like the importance of the garment sector. I mean, some countries like, for example, Cambodia, it's like 60% of goods exports of Cambodia is garment and apparel products. So some of the countries in the region are indeed very, very dependent on this sector. And I think in the past, I mean, you pointed it out rightly. I do think that, I mean, many millions of workers have been able to come out of poverty as well, because, you know, like these jobs were created and were there, and because the country somehow specialized in this. So so I mean, I agree on the points that you made, just like with the addition that, you know, like we should also pay attention, of course, to the quality of jobs. Thanks.
Can I just very quickly, Christian, because I promised you a question about robotics and automation. Can you just very briefly, because we are slowly running out of time, but can you just briefly mention the views from your research on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, you know, like technology and innovation is absolutely important. I think it's important for jobs staying in the region and not moving elsewhere. I think it's also important for productivity and subsequently as well for incomes. So I don't think that there is any doubt about that. But perhaps, you know, like, I think perhaps three things we would need to bear in mind, according to my view. It's like, I mean, yes, like I think many jobs in the region depend like on this labor intensive type of production with lower or medium skilled, like, for example, production in the garment industry. And I mean, I do think that we just also need to be realistic, you know, like if new technologies are going to be adopted in that industry and also in other industries, that to some extent at least are aimed as well as reducing the workforce, then I mean, it's just a fact that, you know, like some of the workers that used to have a job in those industries, I mean, they're going to lose their job. And I mean, it's not really like that, you know, like the day after the garment worker starts then somewhere else as a software engineer or something like that. So I mean, I do think that this is, this is unrealistic. So we will have some workers that are not just not going to have anymore their job. So what I think is very, very important here is the issue of social protection policies. I mean, during the pandemic, governments in this region have put in place unprecedented packages like ad hoc measures to support enterprises, but also workers. And I think it's now really also an opportunity actually to address or to improve the general social protection systems, to address the gaps that have been revealed partially through this pandemic, gaps in terms of coverage, in terms of adequacy, like to kind of like make these systems more resilient to shocks. And then, you know, like second point is, you know, like we all want ASEAN to move up the value chain so that, you know, like new jobs are created or good jobs are created or jobs can be kept. And I mean, this requires investments into new technologies, but I mean, who is going to tell us that, you know, like these investments are going to be done by the companies in this region? So it also depends a lot on the investment climate. And I mean, Southeast Asia is not alone. I mean, there are other regions and countries that are competing there as well. So there, I mean, it's just very, very important, to pay attention, to provide a good investment climate. And I think, you know, nowadays also a good investment climate that also includes respect for core labor standards. For example, I don't think that anyone nowadays, at least I would hope, would want to invest in a region or in a country where we know that, you know, like, for example, child labor at the very bottom of the supply chain might still be very common. So you know, like, I think this is also very, very important. And last but not least, you know, I mean, part of this. Of this investment climate is as well, of course, you know, to provide like a workforce that is skilled, you know, like that is able to deal with the new technologies. And, you know, governments have been quite active, you know, like promoting vocational education. They have been putting forward like specific skills roadmaps for specific sectors. So there's a lot of investment, especially in the development of high-skilled human resources, which is kind of aimed to bring the country to the technological frontier. And, you know, it's just what I think it's also what is important to bear in mind is that it's important to recognize that the future of work might not be high skilled alone. You know, like with these programs, I think this is an important component. but like maybe like those that benefit from those programs are actually those that already receive a relatively good wage or that have actually good employment prospects, while like we should also think about like how to make use of technology and digitalization for all the other millions of workers out there that don't happen to work really at the technological frontier. With that, back to you, Mia.
Thank you, Christian, very much. But let me, yes, I agree with what you were complimenting there. But technology is not going to be used only to produce goods, services, but also to improve the processes. And we are seriously now running out of time. But I have to ask Deb, because she has been, such a strong advocate on digitalization. But Deb, if you can just comment on digitalization in a sphere of reducing trade cost through improving the processes and how that can actually facilitate then regional value chains.
Sure. I mean, that should be fast. So basically, yes, we have too much paper. There is way too much paper involved in trade. And if we've learned anything in the last, again, 2 years of COVID, it's that this amount of paper is enormously inefficient and ineffective. And we should not need to use physical paper to move goods across borders. We should put that online as much as possible, with the giant caveat: we should not just take the form as it is and stick that online. We should rethink this. Do we need this form? Do we need all the parts of this form? Can we have these forms talk to one another so that we only have to put the information in once? And I think we've had a nice example here, for better or for worse in COVID, of why it matters. Because it's, if you can't get in to submit paperwork, if you can't get something chopped, stamped, if you can't get the wet signature, then you often couldn't move goods. And that became a major problem, even in a crisis and even on pandemic goods. So we have got to move these processes online wherever possible, make sure that people have access to digital technologies themselves so they can get online to fill out the forms. And then rethink the processes themselves to make sure that what we're doing online actually delivers bottom line results. And there's a lot of inefficiencies in the system that could be improved. And if we get this right, the savings could be substantial and very important.
And we will need these savings really with the trade cost, shipping and everything going up. Then wherever we can cut costs, it would be really beneficial. But staying, and one more question about technology, that's Kevin, about you. Someone mentioned trade finance. I think Mike mentioned how small and medium-sized enterprises and then women cannot have access to finance, and then trade finance has been a sore spot, globally since the global financial crisis. Probably before that, but we didn't pay attention. Did pandemic and the turn to digital, did it create some new mechanisms to improve access to trade finance? And is it valid for ASEAN?
Yeah, I think that question is definitely right. We started with a lot of fintech, where people were looking, especially for the ASEAN countries, financial inclusion. Right. Countries like Indonesia are 34% banked, right, which means that 34% have a bank account. In India, 2% have a credit card. Right. Trying to fix these issues, I think, were paramount to getting to the more complex issues of trade finance or factoring or receivable funding. Right. And what I think Deborah hit the nail on the head is what COVID has done. From a very positive point of view, it's actually sped up the adoption and the acceptance of a lot of these systems, right? Where prior to this, a lot of people, still relied on physical documentation or physical signatures or chops, etc. Now it's becoming more acceptable to accept something online. Obviously, preventing fraud and forgeries, and that's where the blockchain has come in. So as things transition toward that space, I think, the key thing, I think, in listening to a lot of this is, first of all, we need simple systems, right? Simplicity of systems, simplicity of regulations, so that, like Deborah's mentioned, SMEs can actually understand and avail of these services. It's one thing to have very complex systems. If nobody understands the value is actually lost. We are in quite a useful space, and this has been the opportunity that COVID has afforded us, is we're in a transition. It's not a terminal. We've seen this before historically. This is something that, may be quite positive in the long term. We may look back at this as one of the key enablers as we move towards, reskilling of the population, as what Christian mentioned, re-employment. And what the statistics he mentioned earlier on about people losing their job, that hasn't been a one-way street. That hasn't been employers shutting down services. That's also been the other way, where employees actually decided they don't want to work anymore. This phrase of the great resignation, that has been both ways. So people are stepping away, and from that stepping away, they'll find new things to do. And that is where I think, the opportunity for all of us are to be able to create a system with a light touch of regulatory framework, to be able to, to accept a lot of these new models that may be coming up. And that's some of the things that we look at.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you very much. I hope you are not going to go that direction in terms of resignation. We need you. So Cyn-Young, is there anything that we can do in terms of regional cooperation to improve these financing mechanisms when we talk about, financing to firms rather than huge infrastructure investments? Is there a space for regional cooperation in that? Can you add to what Kevin was talking about, trade finance as well?
Thanks, Mia. Well, ADB has been, surveying the banks and then SMEs for trade finance gap over the past decade or so. And, in recent study, in 2020, in fact, the trade, last year, we actually published this report based on the 2020 results. And the trade finance gap actually is estimated to reach 1.7 trillion US dollars, which is a significant increase compared to the pre-pandemic figure of $1.5 trillion. We also asked the SMEs and then what makes them difficult to introduce the digital technology for their operations, as well as also the banks for incorporating the digital technology in their the banking operations for trade finance. And what we have learned is that many of them think that introducing these new or the adoption of new digital technology requires a significant sunk cost, as well as the lack of the skilled staff who might be able to help the adoption and then use of digital technology in facilitating this the digitalization in the trade finance operations. So many of the SME continue to face challenges in adopting the use of digital technologies in their operations. Another key barriers to trade finance, this has been consistently coming up, the KYC and AML requirements. Well, I see actually Kevin's smiling because this is one of the perennial challenges faced by the SMEs in applying for the trade finance from the banking sector. And the smaller firms, in fact, face even greater challenges. Our study again shows that the SMEs are account for much, they actually account for much less of, the trade finance applications from the, but in the trade finance. But the rejection by the banks, in fact, like we can see a much higher share of SMEs. So while the SMEs do not really apply for the trade finance as much as the larger firms, they will likely be more rejected in their trade finance applications. So it kind of reiterates the challenges that they have been facing in terms of lack of like a collateral, like facing challenges in filling out these the applications due to KYC, AML requirements, and also they are additionally facing the challenges in adopting and then use of technology to improve the efficiency in their operations as well as trade finance application. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cyn-Young, for these extra details. I think it's important to also understand that ADB is continuously sort of working on not only analytical issues, but also, putting this information out there to be used for the business as well. Okay, we do have a number of questions from the audience, and I have to address them. But before I do that, there is an elephant in the room, Mike, and I'm turning to you. You seem to be strongest to tackle it. We are all aware of the possible adverse impacts of the war in Ukraine, sanctions on Russia, and the impacts on energy markets, commodity markets, supply chain connectivity, shipping routes, and all of that. What can you tell us in terms of whether this can be put in the model and something discovered from the model, or how do we understand what's going to happen with ASEAN, for example, and its participation in global and regional value chains?
Well, this is a big question. Obviously, looking from an economic perspective, what's going on with the war in Ukraine has been rattling markets significantly. We're seeing crude oil is falling below $100 on some news this morning. Last week it was $130 a barrel in crude futures. And as Mark Twain once quipped, it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. But because this isn't over yet. But let me just point out a few things. The war and the sanctions are already exacerbating an uncertain economic environment in general, and challenges to value chains in particular. Not everything is bad in terms of the current environment. Global economy seems to be emerging from the pandemic, and this will have an important effect on demand and reduce bottlenecks facing supply chains globally. But of course, this recovery is uneven. As was mentioned earlier, we've got a partial lockdown in China in some areas. But COVID-19 seems to be entering an endemic phase, and knock on wood, the worst is behind us. Inflation is high and interest rates are rising. These are important. These are posing important macroeconomic challenges, but they should be manageable. But the war has created significant uncertainties, and it's not clear exactly how they will be managed. For a region that is so exposed to the global marketplace, such developments obviously pose major risks. The sanctions on Russia are heavy by any definition of the word, and depending on how the war and the peace discussions progress, they could even get heavier. In my view, and obviously I'm just theorizing, how the war will directly affect ASEAN depends critically on how China reacts to Russian sanctions. I think there are two scenarios. One, it decides to continue with business as usual with Russia and ignore the sanctions. This will no doubt lead to significant repercussions for certain Chinese firms that are doing so, which in turn could have significant negative knock-on effects for ASEAN, given the role that China plays in regional value chains. This would lead to a distancing of China from ASEAN at a high cost to both. And I should mention that such an approach would also exacerbate anti-Chinese sentiment in the West, which is already ridiculously high, if I may say, and could pave the way for additional trade restrictions on China, for example. Fortunately, I would give this scenario a very low probability of occurrence, I say from my academic chair. More likely would be a second scenario. China continues to support Russia politically, but respects the Western sanctions on the country, something that seems to be happening already, though I've only got anecdotal data. This would be far less disruptive and could actually lead to deeper regional links and further development of RVCs, I would say, regional value chains. Also, if China is able to adeptly manage this complicated political and economic situation, it would enhance its role as a leader, not only in the region, but also globally. So, I would expect this second option to take place. But again, the war is ongoing. We're still at an initial phase, and it's unclear what's going to happen. And certainly, I think that anybody who would be courageous enough to try to model such an effect at this point in time, I would take my hats off to them, because I would certainly not want to touch that yet.
You are very correct in doing that, but you mentioned something that I think needs to be repeated, and that is that the impacts of this current geopolitical, if I can call it that, situation is not going to be only in terms of the flows of goods and terms of stocks of investment or prices, but it may actually influence the status of multilateral regional institutions and the workings of those. And so if these collapse, and we see fragmentation in these, and some scenarios and some commentators go that way, then of course the level of instability and level of unpredictability is going to go up multiple times, and we are turning back not to the original Cold War, but to even something worse. I would speculate, but that's a pure speculation. Now I have a number of questions, and I'm really happy that most of the questions came from the ArtNet community, so that is adding to my wonderful day. But let me start with a question from Cherdom, who is asking from I think Chula University. Let me find it here. Yeah. Who is asking, would CP, and I'm going to use acronyms now to save the time, would CPTPP be a challenge to RCEP in participating in GVCs, I guess, for the ASEAN economies, ASEAN firms? And I'm turning to you, Deb, first on that, and then if anyone else wants to chip in, please signal.
Sure. I always find that, in a way, the RCEP CPTPP discussions are kind of like pick your favorite child and explain why. I feel like that's a little unfair. Children have different attributes, agreements have different attributes, they're for different regions, different places. So, if you're a member of only one, then obviously you can only use that agreement. If there's only one agreement that applies for the trade that you're working on from where you are to where you need to be, then that's the agreement you use. But in that happy circumstance, when you have more than one option, then the question often comes, which one should I use? And I think this is going to depends on the firm, because sometimes, if most of your trade, for example, is with RCEP countries, but some of your trade is with a CPTPP member like Canada, then you may say, actually, on a default, we use RCEP, but when we trade with Canada, we switch to another agreement. So I think circumstances will vary. But if you were asking me to pick a favorite child, which I do not want to do, I would say, though, that's challenging. But when firms come to us and they ask us to help them use a trade agreement and work through their supply chain, their inventory, what do they do? How do they do it? Where do they do it? How do they sell it? Where are they going to get the most benefits from an agreement? TPP will win every time in the near term, because RCEP, it takes a really long time right now for many of the provisions to come into force. They can be a bit more complicated, and there's a lot more flexibility in RCEP, which governments love and businesses hate. Businesses hate flexibility because it means I don't know as a business whether this applies to me or it doesn't apply to me. TPP has less flexibility. This is the rule. Here it is. Doesn't cover everything that a business cares about. It's not going to solve all of your issues, but it's more consistent rules, and crucially for especially traded goods and also in services, you have zero tariffs on a lot of, especially now, because remember CPTPP officially started in the end of 2018. We're in year 4 actually of tariff cuts for for TPP now. That is a very big deal. Most of those are zero, and zero beats not zero every day of the week. And services trade is much easier on a TPP side than on RCEP. Investment is much easier. It's deeper. So I think if you have an option, if you're in the happy circumstance of having an option, turn to TPP first. But it depends on the circumstances and the structure of your firm and what you're trying to do, whether you can even use TPP or whether as a sort of base case, you should be looking at RCEP. But if you're not using any, that's a missed opportunity. So please do look at these trade agreements and figure out how they apply to you.
Okay, any add-ons from anyone else in the panel on this? It's a very specific question. Unfortunately, another question also coming your way, Deb, but also hopefully someone else can, Mike, you can add that too. And it is about the utilization of preferences. And it's because we all know that agreement is negotiated and it's published, and then when we look at how many firms actually trade along the provisions of the agreement, we come up with very disappointing low level. I remember some of the statistics for ASEAN was for the ASEAN FTA that probably doesn't exist anymore. It was 30%. So would the single rules of origin in RCEP improve the ability of firms to actually utilize the agreement, and how will then this improve the usefulness of the agreement?
Well, that's a much more complicated.
The other part of the question is asking if we do have evidence about whether RTAs of ASEAN were used during the pandemic, and what that may signal for RCEP.
This is a question that's actually harder to answer than it sounds like. So it sounds like you should say, of course, you should use the trade agreements. There's preferences, and that's anyone who uses it gets benefits of people who don't, especially in the form. In this case, what we're talking about largely is the form of lower tariffs or zero tariffs. So it's not about all the other stuff in a trade agreement, it's about the tariffs. But I would say that utilization can be a tricky thing, and even governments struggle to. We literally turned in a project today for governments on using calculating preference utilization. But it's hard for even governments to sort this out, and there's so many complexities. I'll just mention a couple very briefly. If the existing tariff's zero, then you don't use the trade agreement. Why don't you use the trade agreement? Because it gives you no benefits. But this is something that often gets overlooked. So if my tariffs are very low in general, or zero on certain products, like lots of electronic products are zero, then my incentives to use a trade agreement is not high, because why? I already have zero. I can't get better than zero. Zero is zero. So we see utilization rates depending on agreements, sectors, firms, connections. And so governments are often disappointed that you're not using an agreement right away, but there are some good reasons for that. Partly it could be zero. It could also be a complicated agreement to use or to show. So if the rules of origin are super complicated to do, like TPP, let me give you the example on TPP. TPP, if I make a hair tie, is a nightmare to use, because I have to have everything from the yarn through the thread, through the elastic, everything in here has to be from a TPP country in order for me to qualify. I mean, that's how much fabric am I going to get from, Australia? Almost none. So, once you start to do that, then you say, well, no wonder no one uses it in this provision because it's too complicated. So there's like a lot of different reasons that are very sensible for why it is that firms don't use these trade agreements. They could be too complicated. They could give you zero new benefits. You already get benefits. You get benefits somewhere else because you always have to compare them to each other, or just lack of knowledge. So there's a whole lot of reasons why we don't use trade agreements, the preferences that are granted to firms in the way that we hope, some of which you can address, some of which you can't. And you just, at the end of the day, you have to say, let's try to make sure, this would be my advice, try to make sure that wherever possible, we are taking advantage of the preferences that are built into these trade agreements. And if we do that, call it a success.
Great, and so many, of course, we have statistics from WTO that more than half of the trade is still done on MFN that is zero, right? That may be changing now with the, with countries unilaterally starting to actually withdraw MFN preferences for a number of countries or etc. So maybe calculations will be changing, and it will be more beneficial to use even smaller, even if the agreement is not deep, but provides only some smaller tariff reduction, may be actually beneficial in future. Anyway, someone wants to add to this on utilization? No one? Okay. We have gone over time, but and I have to sort of ask you for last word, because you are the core and the main part of this session. So let me ask one question to each one of you. If you had some magic power and you were able to sort of install, design, and implement the policy across ASEAN so that you can foster sustainable development on the wings of fostering value chains as well, what would that policy be? And let me start with Mike. You. Your mic. Okay.
Yeah, I'd have to think about that one for a while, because if I've only got one policy, I want to make sure it's going to be a good one. But frankly, just in general, I think completing the ASEAN Economic Community is extremely important. We haven't talked about that in this session, but I do think it's essential. And I know the ASEAN Economic Community went into effect in December of 2015, but it's part of a process, and we're now nowhere near where we need to be in implementing the various phases of it. So what I would do is I would just go by that rule book and implement it, because I think there's some really positive things in there.
Thank you, Michael. Cyn-Young?
Thanks. Maybe nothing very grand, but I think it's for the post-pandemic, everybody's thinking about like how to make the supply chain more resilient. So I just have a few suggestions to consider in terms of making the supply chain more resilient. There are great potential for using the technology in terms of contributing to that supply chain resilience. First is in terms of identifying the sources, putting those the suppliers and potential producers in the global common network of the production networks, or like information sharing, and then so that there's a greater the transparency, and then also the efficient information sharing, where the suppliers can be easily identified. And second is making the inventory management more efficient. There's I think in the past, the inventory management has been really, done with the sole purpose of efficiency. But I think that now the resilience is another important aspect I mentioned to look at, and having this inventory inventory management with the technology can help both efficiency and resilience, being able to allow the just-in-time and just-in-case the inventory management at the production and inventory management simultaneously. And thirdly, the allowing the diversification of supply chain can be also drawn from the potential of the digital technology. Instead of thinking of the reshoring, I think there's a combination of the nearshoring for the market at the same time, and diversification of the network will potentially increase the supply chain resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You would not be playing good game with Aladdin. You get one wish only. So Kevin, what's your one policy?
If I had one policy, I would wish for a group within ASEAN that would actually be able to help each other and coordinate for ESG, sustainable investments, to help with decarbonization, that education process, because right now there's so much misunderstanding between, just a simple thing with plastics, recyclable versus compostable versus biodegradable, and that misunderstanding is actually wasting a lot of resource within every single country as they try to minimize plastic waste or decarbonization or emissions and all of that. So having a task force within ASEAN that can focus all the governments and maybe cuts across, governmental lines to be able to help each other, I think that would be my one wish.
Thank you, Kevin. Christian.
Yeah, so deciding, just one policy is challenging. I would just put it like in these terms. So I would formulate it as a package. So I do think that well-designed employment and labor market policies and institutions are critical. And I mean, this does include the various types of policies that I've been mentioning, like social protection, skills development, sectoral policies, active labor market policies, gender responsive policies. And I think also in all this is social dialogue is key between workers, employer associations, and governments to design these policies. And I do really think that these policies are really key to support the development of global value chains, and in a way they I think provide the necessary preconditions. So yeah,
I do agree that management of labor resources is very important. So Deb.
Yeah, I would say if we could make policy thinking small first, then we would make simpler policies, and the net result, I think, would drive more growth and development than we would get any other way. So if you think about policy from the perspective of small businesses, then you capture trade in ways that simplifies it and makes it work better for everyone.
Great, thank you. I have actually written down all of these suggestions. They are fantastic, and I think we should, we should do a project on how to create policies that will work, and to this end. Anyway, thank you so much. We are right on a dot 2 hours, and this has been really enjoyable session for me as a moderator, and I hope the audience enjoyed it as well. The comments that I'm seeing are quite nice, and I apologize if I have been a tough moderator, but that I was told that is my role. But I do thank you. I of course thank Caroline for her keynote, and I hope we'll be able to actually meet soon in person or again on the screen to discuss some of these issues that we have pointed is very important and crucial, and that have not been actually discussed because we simply couldn't cover everything. I would like to mention that based on our discussion here and the other work that is in progress, we will be putting out a policy brief and then later on a book from the ADB, and so we will be announcing that, and hopefully also doing another session on the results of that research work. And with that, I thank everyone, also the organizers and behind the scene people who made this happen. We appreciate the audience interventions, and for the questions that we were not able to answer in the session, we will use the email and the name and answer these questions later on. So with this, I hope everyone will be joining in tomorrow in the second day of SEADS 2022, and I wish you pleasant, for me, pleasant evening, and for you, rest of the day or rest of the afternoon. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay happy. Okay, bye-bye, everyone. Thank you so much.